in many ways, for me, it's just thrilling to have Jamie come back because his last lecture, which, as I say, you can now watch on YouTube, if you feel like, oh, I didn't get enough of him tonight, go home and watch it. But in any case, he did present on the dolmens, and that is available through us. But what I want to say is a little bit more about what he's doing now, because he is a curator at the Nicholson Museum at the University of Sydney, and it's a very important collection. I actually did a dissertation on cylinder seals, and some of their cylinder seals are in that collection, and they very kindly let me use them. But before that, he was at the British Museum as a project curator, and he has had a very interesting career. But I think for those of us who follow archaeology, you'd like to know how many places he's excavated. And this is like 2 pages. I'm going to start with, and then I'm going to go to what grants he has for his project this year. But let's say, the game of the glasses. So, in Jordan alone, Pella has been much of the focus of his work, but he's worked at Khirbet Ghozlan, El Karawaji. I actually do want no idea where that is. Where is Kawaraji? Where's, okay, good. I'm glad to know that. Ain Qasiyah, Dra, and Babadra. He's worked in Syria at Tel Brak. He's worked in Uzbekistan. He's worked in Kashmir. He's worked in southern Iraq at the very famous site of Tello, a British museum project. And of course, we'll be talking about the site he's working on now, Khirbet Ghozlan. But he's also worked in Cambodia, in Greece, the Solomon Islands, and of course, Australia, where he comes from, where he hails from. So in terms of diversity of excavation, I don't think you get more diverse than that. But he's also very good about getting funding, which for those of you who are academics, you know it's a key. So for this season alone, he has the Harris Grant from ACOR, he has the Palestine Exploration Fund grant, and he has, I like this one, the Australian Nuclear and Scientific Technology Organization's grant for doing the radiocarbon, right? But actually that's for your Egyptian contents at the Nicholson. Hopefully you get some work from Khirbet Ghozlan. We'll see what happens. In any case, he is somebody who I know will enjoy hearing. Jackie or Tess will be turning off the lights. They'll help anybody certain latecomers be placed. If you feel that you're not in the right place, again, there's a few chairs over here. So please, by all means, don't feel like you have to stay in the back. There are like 3 chairs over here. And we say ahla wa sahla coming to the front. So with no further ado, Jamie Fraser.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barbara, for that really wonderful introduction. Can you hear me up the back? Okay. It is really a thrill to come and give a lecture at ACOR. It's coming back to Jordan is always wonderful, but walking through those front doors at ACOR, as everyone has tonight, and from the moment you step over that threshold and you're greeted with the warmth of Barbara and Jack and Nasreen and Humi and Samia and Zovi, it just feels like coming home. And so it's so wonderful to have an opportunity to be able to share with you tonight some of my research in ACOR, where I really couldn't imagine talking about it anywhere else. So I'm sure everyone in this room has, at some point in their misspent childhood, dared to take an olive fruit directly from the tree and bitten into it just to see what it tastes like. And of course your face shrivels up because it's bitter and disgusting, and you think, how on earth can this possibly be worth dealing with? Of course, olives as a fruit contain a very bitter chemical compound called oleuropen. And for olives to be made palatable, that compound has to be removed or it has to be decomposed. Now, at some point in the history of Jordan's past, ancient people unlocked that secret. And by discovering that process, they unlocked a fuel that revolutionized cooking, they unlocked a fuel that revolutionized lighting, and they discovered a fruit that could be pickled and could be eaten, although that wouldn't really happen until the classical times. It's so integral now to how we conceive of societies around the Mediterranean basin that, of course, we talk long and richly about the Mediterranean diet, those 3 trinities of grape, of grain, and of course of olive. The French author Georges Duhamel is famous for saying the Mediterranean ends where olive trees no longer grow. And I think he's right. Mind you, he was nominated for the Nobel Prize of Literature 27 times and never actually won the thing. So who knows how seriously we can take him. I think of a higher authority on the role of the olive in the greater Mediterranean basin is Vincent van Gogh. And here he did in 1889 a series of 15 images of olive groves in Provence. And this is regarded as one of the high points of his experimentation with colour and with light. This one here is a counterpart to Starry Night, his most famous of images. And he wrote to his brother, and I think these words resonate with anyone who's walked through an olive grove. The rustle of the olive grove has something very secret in it. It is too beautiful for me to dare to paint it, or to be able to even imagine it. Well, luckily for us, he did. And if anyone happens to have a spare $100,000 and an inkling to give me a gift, then this would look really good in my living room. But even Van Gogh, this Kaiser of colour, this Lord of light, even Van Gogh struggled, he said, to be able to portray, to capture the colour of olive trees. He says, I would look at them and they would change from silver to blue to green to bronze to fading white and to violet. What I would like to do today is to take an archaeological perspective on the olive, to really ask the question, how has the olive become so integral to the fabric of Jordanian society, both today and particularly in the Bronze Age? So strap yourselves in, put your tray tables up to their closed position, because we've got a fair amount of ground to cover. We'll briefly look at olive domestication, olive production and the archaeological signatures of olive production. We'll talk a bit about what the early Bronze Age actually means, and then some excavations I'm doing at a site called Khirbet Ghozlan, which I think is an early Bronze Age olive oil factory. And then we'll ruminate a little bit on what olive and urbanism actually means for some larger scale depictions of Bronze Age Jordan. When I'm talking about olive, there are several different species of olive that are scattered around the world. For those in the Mediterranean basin, of course, we're dealing with one particular species that's called Olea europaea, and that's the olive that is so familiar and so iconic of the Mediterranean world. The Mediterranean has these optimal conditions for olive to grow in. For temperature, we're dealing with hot, dry summers, cool winters. Olive can tolerate cool climate, but anything that drops to below 7 degrees Celsius for a prolonged period of time is no good because it kills off younger trees, so no snowbound areas. And olive loves a bit of rainfall, usually around at least 400 millimetres per year, but what's more important is that olive tree roots rot very easily. So they really have to be located in well-drained areas. And if you look at the southern Levant, you can see there's no olive on the coastal strip or really in the Jordan Valley. The coastal strip is too temperate. The Jordan Valley, at least historically, has been too moist. But the rift escarpment, the hills rising up sharply on either side, that's not too temperate, that's not too moist, that's just right. It's the Goldilocks zone of olive oil production. When we're dealing with olive oil, with olive domestication, it's really quite complex. There are over 1,200 species of domestic cultivated olives in the Mediterranean at the moment. Wild species of olives still exist, and feral olives, which are olives that were domesticated and then they become wild again. And all of these cross-pollinate and interbreed. So trying to untangle the family tree of the domestic olive is, well, it's really as twisted and as gnarled as an olive tree is itself. But historically, or at least traditionally, if you go off the archaeological evidence of looking for domesticated olive seeds in archaeological contexts, archaeologists have said, well, olives were probably domesticated in the East Mediterranean around about 4,500, 4,000 years ago. And then it moved westward into Greece, moved westward into Italy, moved westward into Spain. And that's kind of been the narrative for a while. And then genetics and DNA came along. And like Dorothy from black and white Kansas landing in Technicolor Oz, suddenly our whole idea of olive domestication has changed. And it's really in flux. Now I'm going to give you a very simplified version, largely because I read these genetic papers and my brain melts. But really we're dealing with at least 3 separate olive domestication events. One around 4,500 years, 4,000 years in the Jordan Valley and probably the Turkish-Syrian border. Another different species being domesticated in Greece, particularly Crete, around about 3,500 years ago. And then Spain. Things get a little complicated. There looks to be a domestication event in Spain much the same time as the Levant, but most olive trees you see in Spain now have got nothing to do with this original domesticated species. It's really Levantine species that were brought across the Mediterranean by the Phoenicians around about 1000 BC, give or take. Now, you put 2 different geneticists in a room and you end up with 3 opinions and some broken limbs. But generally, I think that kind of sums things up. In the Levant, we start seeing domesticated olives in the archaeological record with any sort of significance in the late Neolithic period. So 6,500, 5,000 years ago. Now, if you're sitting there going, well, hang on, you just said it didn't start till 4,500 years ago. Well, congratulations, you're very sharp and you're absolutely right. Late Neolithic olive isn't domesticated olive, it's wild olive, but olive that's been used from wild species in sort of domesticated ways. And some of the best finds have come from an anaerobic environment, meaning it's a waterlogged Neolithic village off the Mediterranean coast, and hundreds and hundreds of seeds and evidence for pressing have been found from there, but it's from wild olive species. But what we're seeing is the first steps in what will be a gradual process that eventually leads to domesticated, cultivated olives, which really show up in the archaeological record in the Levant, well, around about 4,500, 4,400 years BCE. And some of the earliest evidence comes from Talila Rasul from the University of Sydney Excavations down near the Dead Sea. And I've got some images up here showing Chalcolithic Pella up in the North Jordan Valley, because the Chalcolithic period itself is tremendously important for setting in place all the mechanisms which will underwrite the urban revolution which will come. And so at Pella, University of Sydney has excavated an olive oil farmstead, which is kind of a nice comparison to our current project. But there's also evidence for large storage of agricultural surplus for the first time. So putting in place things that can lead to specialisation, risk management that really presage urbanism. Now, forgive me the next slide, it's tremendously self-indulgent, but I can't mention Pella by saying why it's such a special site for me, and that's because after the season in 2015, my wife and I got married in one of the ruined Byzantine period churches there. And you can see Kristen here on the right. And if I had any doubts that she was the woman for me, it's when she walked down through the ruins in her wonderful wedding dress while wearing her dig boots that I thought, she's a keeper. But back to the serious stuff. The early Bronze Age, so we're talking now the 4th millennium BC, is really the period in which olive cultivation supercharges and it becomes a major international export, being exported with Egypt. And what you're seeing here is it's about the size of an A5 sheet. It's a tablet in Egypt, and it's talking about the 7 sacred oils that are used to anoint the body in mummification, each written in one of these registers. And the oil that's written here is called Sefich oil. Now, Egyptologists are not quite sure what that means, but for a whole variety of reasons, they think that's olive oil from the Levant. And if you look at the glyph, the diminutive that's used to indicate this oil, it's a pottery vessel. And several Egyptologists, and I thank Karen Sawada at Macquarie University for bringing it to my attention, several archaeologists say, well, that jar for Sefich oil looks very similar to a certain jar called combed ware vessels, and these are manufactured in the Levant and used to ship olive oil down to Egypt. Now, if you look at the back of the Jordan Times today, you'll find what the current price for a barrel of crude oil is. I checked, it's $56.66. Well, this is the ancient oil barrel from 5,000 years ago, and I think that's pretty cool. So in terms of olive oil processing, there's a tremendous sort of extraction process that we have to undergo both now and both in the ancient past. And although we've got mechanized industrial systems to do it now, actually the stages themselves remain much the same. First up, you've got to harvest the oil, whether it's by beating the tree or by picking the olives, or today you can get mechanized tree shakers that shake it all about, or hugely sort of apocalyptic looking like vehicles like this. The olives then need to be sorted. So there's a lot of debris in there, twigs and leaves and stems that have got to be hand-picked and removed, or put onto large vibrating screens which shake out all that debris. And then the olives have to be washed, particularly if they've been gathering dust all through the summer period. The problem with introducing water to this process, though, is that it leads to emulsification. And by that I mean you get minute droplets of water mixing with the oil, which lowers the quality of the oil. So one of the traditional ways around it, and one of the ways that really olives are still harvested in this area today, and I'm sure most of you know it here, is that the olive harvest happens after the first autumn rains have already washed the fruit for you. The olives then need to be crushed, whether it's crushed under a rolling mill or on some of these more upright olive millstones that you see from the Iron Age or classical periods, or today in one of these barrels that spin it round and hurl the olive against the side of the machine to crush it that way. Incidentally, I just draw your attention to this central photograph. This is one of the photographs I've used. I've used a couple in this presentation from ACOR's archive, and when Barbara says to check it out, do yourself a favour and go and spend 5 minutes looking at the ACOR photographic archive. There are some remarkable gems in there, and tremendously informative for a whole range of things. Once that initial crushing has taken place, that's generated a kind of like a paste. And that paste then needs to be laid into a series of mats, fibrous mats from hair or vegetable fibre, and those mats are then stacked and then pressed by weight, either by weighing them down with stones or, of course, using the standard lever presses, which you're also familiar with, to press the juice out, or even by these screw presses here. More modern techniques put it in a large barrel and use centrifugal forces to spin it around and separate the juice from the actual waste debris. What is generated then is a sort of a mixture of oil and of water and of particulate matter. And scooping the first oil off that extraction, that's the first press oil. That's the purest oil, the best flavoured oil. That's the stuff, if you see on special in the supermarket, you grab instantly, because that's the things that you want to dip your za'atar into. And just before I leave the pressing, I love this image from National Geographic from 1944, trying to show ancient Greek olive pressing. And you can see what the illustrator's trying to do. He's gone off looking at various pots, but you can see everyone harvesting olives up the tree with no clothes on whatsoever, which to me just seems like a scorpion accident waiting to happen, if not a sort of sunburn and splinters. But you can see the press down here, the stacked up mats with a stone collection vat channeling the juice into a collection tank with weight applied to the lever to press it down. And the illustrator's not really let his mind run wild by putting the shab on the side, because of course that's how the ancient Greeks said that they did it at the time. That juice then needs to be left to filter, and either in ceramic jars, where the oil, of course, over the course of several weeks or several months, rises up to the top and the water sinks to the bottom with the particulate matter, which means you can then scoop the pure olive oil off. or in large stainless steel vats where once it's separated, you simply turn the taps and let the water run out, left with the purer olive oil. So that's kind of the process. Now, putting your Indiana Jones hats on and picking up your trowels, if you were to go hunting olive production in the archaeological record, what sort of things would you expect to find? And that's a question that I'm kind of grappling with at the moment. And you would expect to find the installations, the features, things like the press itself, the rock cut features for channeling or for collecting the oil, the various other accessories, the crushing stones, the decanting vats, the storage or the collection pottery vase. But we're missing something really, really fundamental from this image. Anyone got any idea what they've overlooked? The olives themselves. Because we would expect to find either complete olive pits or more probably the olive pits once they've been crushed. Now, to get into the archaeological record, they have to be burned so they preserve and don't rot away, but they're two pretty fundamental things that we also need to look at as well. So, we've gone through the history and the process of olive oil. Park that in one side of your brain for now. We'll come back to that. Now we just need to deal very quickly with the early Bronze Age and what I actually mean by that and why it's so important. So the early Bronze Age, we're talking from the 4th and the 3rd millennia BCE. Archaeologists have divided it into 4 sub-periods based on different sorts of ceramics. And because archaeologists are fairly unimaginative when it comes to this sort of stuff, they've called it Early Bronze 1, Early Bronze 2, Early Bronze 3, and Early Bronze 4. EB1, EB2, EB3, and EB4. And this EB4 period, the latter half of the 3rd millennium BC, that's what we're going to be talking a lot about today. Now, in the Early Bronze 1 period, for most of the 4th millennia BC, this is a period where people are living in increasingly complex villages and towns, and it's also the period when the olive oil trade with Egypt, at least in the southern Levant, flourishes. That's when it's really turbocharging. Now, toward the end of this period, up around about 3100 BCE, give or take, we start to see the first cities emerge of the southern Levant. By that I mean people living in large, mounded central places surrounded by monumental fortification walls, enclosing architecture for civic authority, so things like palaces or temples, things like this. And that urban experiment flourishes through the EB2 and the EB3 period, but something happens at the end of the EB3 period when all of these mounded settlements, like Pella, are abandoned and the population disperses out into the rural hinterlands. Now, it's not like the zombie apocalypse. It doesn't happen overnight. I think, picture yourself being in, say, a NASA space station, looking down on the Levant at night, and you're seeing just gradually, one by one, these city lights slowly turning themselves off over the course of several centuries. It's a gradual process. But the end result is a very dispersed rural landscape that characterizes the EB4. Now, traditionally, the explanations for why this urban experiment failed are yoked in sort of 2 culprits. The first one is climate, that the climate became a lot drier. And the second one is military incursions from Egypt itself. The problem is, as we refine our radiocarbon chronology of this EB4 period, it's been pushing further and further back, so it's now starting around about 2600, 2500 BC. And there is a major shift in climate, but it happens at 2200 BC. And we do know that Egyptians are leading armies and doing incursions, but it's only happening a few more centuries before that, probably taking advantage of a weakened social state in the Levant, but not being the cause of it. So we don't really know. But I think olive has a role to play, because in the early Bronze 2-3 period, the Egyptians stopped trading olive oil with the southern Levant. In part, it's because of development in shipping. They start shipping all the way up to Lebanon and Syria and trading olive oil there, hooking with the winds and the currents across to Cyprus, picking up a load of copper, and then coming all the way back down to the Nile Delta. Now, does this cessation of trade cause the social collapse, or does the social collapse mean that the Egyptians just simply stopped trading with them? It's a real chicken and egg scenario. We don't really know, but olive has a role to play there somewhere, I think. So what does this early Bronze 4 period actually look like? What does it mean to be rural in this period of urban collapse? Now, if you open a textbook, what the traditional sort of story says is people leave their centralized, fortified cities and they disperse off into small farming communities around the landscape and do traditional sorts of agro-pastoral farming. And that's probably right for most of these sorts of settlements. We get a proliferation of small, undefended, tiny village sites. But as researchers are picking up traction with this period, we're realizing that it's a bit more complicated. There are sort of several medium-sized sites that remain occupied, albeit at a far reduced level, of these older cities, often incorporating or even living across the city walls, although they're not building any new ones from scratch. And there are also three, I mean, this is probably one large one, but three large 20 hectares, 25 hectare large, sprawling, unfortified settlements that get founded anew in the Jordan Valley. And I think climate has something to do with this, because each of them are on a primary water source that's not just the Jordan River, but the Yarmouk, the Zarqa, and the Kafrain. So there is complexity within the settlement landscape, but we haven't really got our head around it yet. And then there's another type of site which we haven't really grappled with at all. And by that, I'm talking enclosure sites. And this is what Khirbet Ghozlan actually is. In all respects, it's exactly like the first one, small, tiny, all through the landscape, but they're defended by an enclosure wall. Now, I came across the site of Khirbet Ghozlan, which is only 0.4 hectares, only about 4 dunams, when I was surveying in the Wadi Ar-Rayyan a few years ago. And I was surveying, as Barbara said, for Dolmen 2 monuments, so we mapped it and we recorded it, but I didn't really understand it. I thought, well, this is strange, an early Bronze 4 site with apparently an enclosure wall. That doesn't seem right. But I put it at the back of my mind and went on writing my thesis. And well, I probably shouldn't admit this in a public environment, but I've got something really nerdy, which I love doing. And that's when I've got a large pile of ironing to do back in Sydney, the best thing to get through the ironing is to put my laptop on the side of the ironing board and I find a lecture of someone who I've been wanting to get up to speed with. And the ACOR YouTube channel is brilliant. And so I had a pile of ironing in Sydney, listening to a lecture at this very lectern by Professor Susanna Richard, who directs the EB4 side of Khirbet Iskander, giving an overview of the early Bronze 4 period. And she put up a slide, and that slide looked very similar to this, and she said, and there's something else going on here because we've got all these weird small enclosed sites, but I've got no idea what they are and what they mean. And I thought, oh my God, that's Khirbet Ghozlan. That's one of these. It has to be one of these types of sites. So there's a pattern here. I wonder if by understanding and unpicking at the pattern, we can start to explain what it means. And the driving question here is why defend such small sites? Any archaeological survey finding these really tiny sites would normally classify them as, well, often not even a village, maybe a hamlet or a farmstead, but they're all small, they're all newly founded, they're all located in very defensible positions, and they're all located in upland zones. Now, there are two sorts of theories to explain this that's out there in the literature. The first is by the excavators at Khirbet Ghozlan, who turned up and said, it's an early Bronze 4 site, it's got an enclosure wall. This is amazing, this is unique. It must be a first order site ruling all the other sites around it. And I don't agree with that for two reasons. The first is they haven't really read about what's going on in the whole landscape, about these other sorts of sites. But also Tel Hamad, this massive 20 hectare concentration of population in the valley, would that be ruled by a tiny half hectare site in the hills? It seems completely the wrong way around. A more sophisticated view, I think, is by Gaetano Palumbo, an Italian archaeologist who was recording at Jebel Rahayel. And he said, okay, we've got this fortified EB4 site. It's right on the edge between the desert and the agricultural zones. Maybe the early Bronze 4 farmers there got really sick and tired of nomads coming in and raiding their village. And so they defended their village for protection. And it makes a bit of sense, but it doesn't explain why other early Bronze 4 villages all around this same environmental zone weren't defended. And it doesn't explain why other sites in very fertile areas were defended. So can we come up with another explanation? And I think we can. And I think it's all about this upland location. Because remember that slide I showed at the beginning? This is the Goldilocks zone for olive growing. So I propose a research hypothesis that are these sites specialized production sites just for the production of olive oil? And if you imagine being up in these areas in the early Bronze 4, at this time of year when the olive harvest is going, generating huge concentrations of olive oil, that liquid gold, in one discrete point in the landscape, well, I would want to defend that too, because that's the most precious commodity you're producing. And so maybe these small sites are defended to protect seasonal olive harvest. Now that's all well and good in theory, but we've got to go and actually move some dirt and test it out. And so we return to the Wadi Rayyan, the Wadi previously known as the Wadi Yabas. And you may, of course, know this from the poem Ashiyat Wadi al-Yabas by Arar, that sort of uncrowned national poet of Jordan, Mustafa Wahbi Tal, who wrote about the Wadi Yabas. His name was changed to Rayyan a few years ago. And Khirbet Ghozlan sits about halfway up this wadi, and it's one of the most well-watered wadis in Jordan. And in the springtime, I think it's one of the most beautiful places on the planet in the springtime. So as Barbara said, for my PhD, I was actually surveying along one particular ridgeline, the ridgeline called Tel Ras, where there are several hundred stone-built dolmen tombs, and I was doing recording and mapping all of these sorts of things at the same time as we recorded the site of Tel Ras. And so you can see along the ridgeline, the red dots are those dolmen tombs, the blue dots are sort of other cairn features, but it might be a bit hard to make out, but you can see scatters of yellow dots as well. And they're rock-cut features, either large classical period wine presses or several of these much smaller rock cut into the limestone olive presses. And what you're looking at is a rectangular vat or tank at the top, a circular channel draining the liquid into a round collection vat or somewhere where you could lean your storage jar to capture the liquid at the bottom. Now, we don't know when this was used. We can't date it, but it looks the sort of thing we're after. Now, if you stand on this, see this knoll sticking out in the wadi here? That's where Khirbet Ghozlan is located. And if you stand on that knoll and you look due east down the wadi, this is what you're seeing down to the Jordan Valley. And if you spin around 180 degrees and look straight up the wadi, that's what you're seeing, all the way up to, does anyone recognize what would be on the top up there? Ajloon. So it commands the entire wadi itself. So this is Khirbet Ghozlan. So you can see there are two grey rings around it. Ignore those. Those are large sort of mounds of rubble that were probably created as an animal corral in the Roman period going off the pottery. But can you see the fortification wall? Up at this end, it's built of two rows of some really massive boulders. And it continues as quite large around the corner. And then it turns into almost a symbolic enclosure around the rest of the site, and that's because of the nature of the contours of the site. It's biggest and it's most pronounced where you access the site from the Tel Ras Ridge, and it's less pronounced where there's natural defences where the site itself drops away. Now, when we mapped that site when I was doing my dolmen survey, largely because a new olive grove had been constructed right near the site and seemed to threaten its survival. And so I was just keeping it in the back of my mind every so often. So it was really wonderful when Bob Bewley in the aerial photography, Apamia, project did their standard annual announcement saying, we're about to do flights for taking aerial photographs of sites in Jordan. If you've got a site you would like to have photographed, give us the coordinates and we'll do our best. It's a wonderful piece of collaborative research to which we should all aspire. And in October 2016, this is the image that they sent back. You can see the farmer has bulldozed a track right through the northwest edge of that enclosure, probably to build another olive grove adjacent. So I then hustled some funding together for a rescue dig to try and get out there and actually examine this site while we could and hopefully help protect the site and work out what actually is going on at Khirbet Ghozlan. And just to pause at this moment to acknowledge how deeply indebted I am to the Curtis T. and Mary G. Brennan Foundation and to the Wainwright Fund at Oxford. It's a big ask to approach someone and ask for money for a whole new project, to say, I want to test out this idea on a site that, as you'll see, is quite shallow. We could go from topsoil to bedrock. It's a bit of a gamble, but luckily they got behind it, and I'm tremendously grateful, because if they didn't, this project would have died before it even started. Now, we sunk trenches in two areas. So 2 trenches through here. This is an outcrop of bedrock, so from bedrock across one of the rubble rings. And I'll talk about these ones first. So if you stand on that bedrock outcrop, you look down the trenches, that's what you're seeing up the Wadi. And below topsoil, we came to a level of rock tumble. We found actually this in every single one of the trenches we dug. But you can start to see some walls appearing out of the trench. And that turned into a architectural complex that was preserved 4 or 5 courses high, which was really quite remarkable considering what we were expecting. That's a photogrammetry model done by Ihab al-Jariri from the Department of Antiquities. If we drape our architectural plan on it, you can see that the whole unit has been built against that bedrock outcrop coming up. And within some of these rooms, we've got 2 pounders or grinders built within the bedrock cavities and then smoothed over to make earth surfaces, as you can see on the picture of the right. 3 of these really small units, too small to live in, these are probably some sort of storage feature, and 18 complete or partly complete, but certainly in situ, storage jars, all sitting on the floor surfaces, all lined up against the walls. Now, in the 2 trenches in the north, we opened this really because we wanted to date that enclosure wall, and we did that, and I'm very comfortable that dates the early Bronze 4. And what you see there is you can see the 2 lines of the enclosure at this point. You can see how massive some of these stones are by looking at the front of their face. But again, we came down to bedrock pretty quickly, but this dived down into a large basin, and that basin here had been used as a rubbish tip, a midden, sort of full of broken pottery in various layers that had been thrown all the way into it. But we did nick a wall on one side, so we chased that way into this trench. We thought, okay, there's a room or something coming up. But no, there was no floor surface, it didn't kind of work. This weird trough-like feature in the middle, and I think what we're looking at is an animal pen. So we had a storage complex or something like that in the middle with a rubbish tip and probably an animal pen next to it, adjacent to the actual fortification or defensive wall. So in short, what we're looking at is a knoll that appears to have been constructed by the enclosure wall first, at least certainly the walls up on this side of it, and I suspect before all of it we'll be working that out this coming season. No evidence for modification, very short-lived occupation. There was very little debris that you would associate with general domestic living. Each of the rooms had only one earth surface in them that hadn't built up over time. And then that whole complex was abandoned and left standing, and it gradually fell over into this kind of ruin field that existed on the Tell on the site for ages. So, now I said don't forget all the olive oil stuff. This is where it comes into traction. Put back on your Indiana Jones hats and go, okay, smarty pants, you said what we have to look for, show us what you've got. So, first of all, from the almost 7,000 sherds that came out of those 4 trenches, 83% are from storage jars. And that's an extraordinary ratio. The whole assemblage is dominated by store jars. The rest of it's mostly cooking pots and mostly small bowls. Small bowls out of which you can eat, small bowls which you can also use as scoops, I think. And what we're missing are the platters and the juglets and the serving vessels that you would associate with standard domestic behaviour. And these are some of the drawings that are done by Munjad Qasim. We got one of the partly complete jars with a spout up near the neck of it. And we had fragments of several others coming up, particularly from the rubbish midden. Now, these jars are about this big. You imagine filling one of these with water, with some sort of liquid, and then actually picking it up and trying to pour it. It would be really heavy, really cumbersome. I don't think this is a pouring jar. I think these are decanting jars. So imagine taking that olive juice after the pressing, leaving it in something like that to filter over the course of a few days or a few weeks until you've got the oil at the top and the water at the bottom. And then if you pour water in, the oil's going to come up and naturally come out the spout. And I wonder if that's what we're dealing with here. One of the other things we're after is, of course, the olive itself. Now, it was really disappointing, largely because there's no ash and no domestic debris around the place, that very few organic remains were actually coming out of the soil. What we did do is when we found, while we were digging, a fleck of charcoal, we would carefully bag that up in some alfoil and package that up. We only got 14 of those, very little charcoal, only 14 samples. But what we did was we sent that to Dr. Caroline Cartwright at the British Museum. Now, Caroline is the world's authority on wood anatomy. So what she does is put those samples under a scanning electron microscope and look at their sort of anatomical structure, and she works out the species, and she does that by looking at the species from the sample from three different angles. Now, Caroline is a very busy woman. Her skills are very much in demand. And after a few months after I sent these samples, she actually was passing through Sydney. So she was kind enough to come and visit. And I took her for dinner at a Thai restaurant out near the campus. But I knew she's busy. I didn't want to raise it. And she got to the end of the dinner and she said, "Jamie, you've been very good. You haven't asked me if I've done your samples." And I said, "Caroline, I know you're very busy." And she said, "Well, I have. And you know what? There's olive wood. They're burning olive wood." And I went, "That's fantastic. That's exactly what I wanted." And she said, no, you don't understand. They're only burning olive wood. I've never seen this before. Every single one of those samples, albeit only 14, are from olive trees. It's quite unusual. It's quite extraordinary. This is what I love these images. I think these are so beautiful. This is an olive wood sample under a scanning electron microscope. Here's the structure of it, and that great big tear in this one down here is from the heat. Now, why would burned olive wood enter the archaeological record here? Well, I think what we're dealing with are orchard prunings. So at the end of orchard maintenance, you end up with a whole bunch of olive branches and leaves, which in order to get rid of the waste, you burn off, or you stockpile it, it dries, and then you've got a ready supply of firewood the next time you're visiting the area. But in addition to the charcoal, we were also taking organic remains from the soil itself. And this means we were doing flotation. So we're taking 20 litres of soil from good early Bronze 4 deposits, putting them into a bucket of water. That gets agitated with a motor, and all the bits of trapped organic charred remains in the soil get loosened, they float to the surface, and you scoop them off the top. Now, I've worked a lot with the flotation at Pella. I know what to expect. I know to look for the wheat and the barley and the lentils and the legumes and the pomegranate and the fig. And when I was doing the flotation at Khirbet Ghozlan, we got absolutely none of that. And it was getting really despondent. Nothing, not even olive. All we were getting was kind of like small flecks, like a fly paper. But after Caroline's success with the olive charcoal, she said, "Well, send me the flotation residues and I'll give them a go." And luckily, the Mediterranean Archaeological Trust funded this stage as well. We're very grateful, because what Caroline found in those sorts of flecks were small bits of charcoal of olive wood again, but from the small tiny shoots and the saplings that you would really only burn if you were been removing them as part of the pruning process. And in addition, okay, it's not the prettiest, but what you're looking at is really cool because coming out of almost every sample were just small flecks of the olive gift, that crushed olive stone that you get as a byproduct from the crushing stage. And that olive gift, I mean, once you extracted the juice, that gift itself is really valuable because when it's dried, it's still got a lot of oil within the wood. It's a great source of fuel. Or, as I was speaking to Francesca just up there today, you can put it back on the olive trees as fertilizer as well. And so there's the gift also. Now, this matters. It matters that only olive wood was found because it implies that no other species were being sought. In other words, that there was a plentiful supply of olive wood, and that's pretty consistent with olive orchard prunings. And it also matters that no charred seeds were found. Now, charred seeds, to get into the archaeological record, they have to be burned, otherwise they just rot away. And seeds will get burned by accident, by being kicked in a fire or being in a building that's caught fire itself, but usually because of animal dung. The animals eat seeds, they then have the animal dung, which when it's dried is used as a source of fuel. And the fact that no charred seeds are found indicates also that there's no animal dung being used for fuel here. In other words, they're still burning the olive orchard prunings. Now, there's a site at the mouth of the Wadi Ar-Rayyan called Tel Abu Niyaj, which is contemporary. It's occupied all through the early Bronze 4 period. And it was dug by the University of Arizona. And out of all the sites in Jordan, it's one of the best sites from which organic remains have been studied and analysed and published. So if we want to know what should we expect an early bronze farming village to look like at this sort of botanical level, we don't have to go very far because they've done it just down the road at Tel Abu Niyaj. And the wood that they're burning, sure, half of it's olive tax, so we're talking this column here, mostly from fig because it's down in the Jordan Valley, but they're also gathering up trees and scrubs from just around the place. And in terms of charred seeds, they're coming out by the bucketful, and there's wild species and cereals and some orchard taxa. They're burning everything consistent with burning animal dung. So it's really important that we're only getting olive wood from the charcoal and from the flotation. So put all that together, have we got evidence for olive oil processing at this tiny site of Ghozlan? I think we do. I think we've got evidence for the harvesting with the burned branches and the burned shoots. I think we've got evidence for the crushing with the residual gift, possibly the grinders. I think we've got evidence for the pressing with the olive presses which are scattered up and down the ridgeline overlooking the site, possibly with the filtering with these decanting vats, and particularly for storage with the hugely overwhelming storage flavour to the ceramic assemblage. But there's also an absence of evidence we have to take into account. Now, absence of evidence is always tricky, but here we've got an absence of evidence for standard domestic occupation, which implies that we really are looking at a specialised site. We've got very limited occupation, really only single surfaces in the rooms, very little domestic ashy debris. There's no remodelling, no reuse of architecture, and with a restricted ceramic assemblage really implies that we're not got anyone who's living there for most of the year round. So how do we all explain that? How do we devise a model that can explain all of that data they just outlined, plus account for its position in the settlement landscape in this period, and explain why on earth some community in the early Bronze 4 decided to go to the effort of surrounding this site with a massive enclosure wall? Well, I think we really do have to think about this site as being a seasonal site. That is, people are coming up episodically and using it for short periods of time. And of course, we know that the olive harvest is a seasonal event. We can go outside and see that happening today, or read an ACOR blog that was written about this by one of the postdoctoral fellows a few years ago. But really, I think some of the best evidence, we can go all the way back to the 10th century BC to an inscribed calendar from Tel el-Jezza, and what is on there is very handy because it sets up a calendar for being a farmer in the 10th century BC. And it says in July and August, you should spend 2 months pruning your orchards. And you should come back to them in October, November, because that's the time that you should start harvesting them and pressing your oil. So I think this model works best to explain this site, that we're dealing with an olive oil factory that people are coming up to in July and August, maintaining their orchards, stockpiling their olive wood, and then returning in October, November after the first autumn rains and doing the press. And I think really the best analogy is one of these modern olive oil factories today, these Master Zaytun, because this is one in the Wadi Ar-Rayyan, very close to the site actually, near Khirbet. And for 10 months of the year, it's locked. All of its equipment is under plastic and the lights are out. And then around October, and the olive season's just been declared open on October the 15th, the lights go on, the door opens, the machines get started up, and everyone brings in their olives for harvesting. The big question, of course, is where are they coming from to get to Khirbet Ghozlan? Are they coming from surrounding settlements in the Wadi Ar-Rayyan, or are they coming from settlements down in the lowlands who are still using these kind of micro-environmental zones in the uplands to harvest their olive? And I suspect for a whole lot of reasons we're looking at lowland and upland communication. And that's really important because it's showing that despite this period of urban collapse, we've got all this rural complexity that's still going on, that's still underscoring these rural ways of life. So why does all this matter? Why do we care about an olive oil factory in the early Bronze for? Well, at one level, I think it's really quite interesting that such a small site with such small, like literally microscopic data can have something to say about some of the bigger issues at play in how we understand the archaeology of Jordan. And one of the biggest issues for this period is how do we conceive of urbanism? What should it look like? Because at the time that people are pressing olives here at Khirbet Ghozlan, in southern Mesopotamia, in sites like which is 100 hectares in size at this time, which is home to about 65,000 people, which is probably the largest city on the planet, that's happening as well. And our narratives for understanding this urban process have been formulated on the floodplains of southern Iraq, where you have people living in one place, large agricultural surpluses that get brought in and then get redistributed through the temples or used to bring in luxury goods from outside. Jordan looks different. And for a long time we've been scratching our heads going, these urban sites from the early Bronze Age, they don't get much beyond 8 hectares, 10 hectares, 12 hectares. They don't even approach the large sites of southern Mesopotamia. Does that make Jordanian urbanism null? Is it not as complex? Or are we just looking at something that's very different? And really, I think this is where we're at the moment by looking at how Jordanian urbanism in the early Bronze Age is taking advantage of all these different micro-environmental zones because it's a very different landscape to southern Iraq. And you might have read Saab's article about this in the Jordan Times on the weekend, looking at Khirbet Ghozlan. Here, perhaps we have urban centres, these small cities of 10 hectares, places like Pella or Khirbet Ghozlan, but they're controlling a hinterland where there's a whole lot of different rural complexity going on, a whole lot of different rural industries, and they're the sinews that tie the whole urban expression together. And you might not have 65,000 people living in one place, but you take it as a system and suddenly you're approaching the scale of Mesopotamia. And that's fundamentally different to how we've perceived of urbanism in the past. But also, olive production must play a key role in how we understand that. And so when we see that urban fabric disintegrate at the end of the early Bronze III period, what happens to the olive oil at that point? And what we're seeing here, I think, is Khirbet Ghozlan is the maintenance of those economic sinews, continuing as they've always done to underwrite the urban expression of the EB23, and ultimately maintain those economic sinews around which urbanism gets re-embodied in the second millennium BC, in the Middle Bronze Age, at which point it can reconstitute itself again. We're going out into the field again for another 4 weeks. We start on Saturday, inshallah, and hopefully there won't be too much rain, although I'm sure the olive growers would love it. Just a very quick mention that I am deeply indebted for the Brennan Foundation, who have decided to fund this project for a second time. It's really humbling to have that. And as Barbara mentioned, the Harris Grant from ACOR, the Palestine Exploration Fund, and the Australian Academy of the Humanities, although I was impressed that you almost said Austrian Academy of the Humanities, because I'm sure they've got more money, are also funding this project as well, which is really tremendous of them. So I'll let you know how we go. Thank you very much.